1:30, so I am going to start. You have landed in Eva's webinar, Organizational Assessment and Strategies to Offset the Impacts of Vicarious Trauma. And just as we're still just landing and finding our way, we're going to listen to some poetry written by the fabulous Pat Parker. Pat Parker was a feminist lesbian poet and activist working tirelessly on inclusion and rights and safety of Black people and queer people. And this poem is called Legacy, and it is being read by Rhonda Simmons, who is a visual artist.
It is from the past that I come, surrounded by sisters in blood and in spirit. It is this past that I bequeath, a history of work and struggle. Each generation improves the world for the next. My grandparents willed me strength. My parents willed me pride. I will to you rage. I give you a world incomplete, a world where women still are property and chattel, where color still shuts doors, where sexual choice still threatens. But I give you a legacy of doers, of people who take risks to chisel the crack wider. Take the strength that you may wage a long battle. Take the pride that you can never stand small. Take the rage that you can never settle for less. These be the things I pass to you, my daughter. If this is the result of perversion, let the world stand screaming. You will mute their voices with your life. It is from the past that I come.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. This is our third webinar in our Mitigating Vicarious Trauma series. This one is Organizational Assessment and Strategies to Prevent Vicarious Trauma in the Anti-Violence Workforce. Registration for this is quite high, so we're really pleased that people are really interested in this really important topic. It's facilitated by Susan Armstrong and Kate Rossiter. Susan, as many of you know, is a registered clinical counselor. She provides counseling and clinical supervision alongside her therapy dog Gracie in her private practice in Vernon, BC. She has over 30 years of experience working as a therapist, a clinical supervisor, a researcher, a community educator in the field of trauma. And for 10 years, she worked exclusively in Indigenous community and commenced a therapy program for Indigenous children and youth in permanent care. Susan has been a program manager for a large rural nonprofit and an executive director for an urban mental health agency. And supporting women on the front line of anti-violence work is one of Susan's passions, and it's something she does very, very well indeed. Kate, please say hello, Kate. Kate Rossiter is the Research and Projects Manager right here at EVA BC and an adjunct professor in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University. She was the lead author of a recent research paper on community-based anti-violence worker wellness, which is well worth the read. It was prepared by EVA BC for the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime. We will be putting the link shortly in the chat for that. She's a recent graduate of the Federation of Community Social Services of BC's Leadership 2020 program, and she's currently completing a certificate program in nonprofit management at Simon Fraser University. She has a genuine passion, I can tell you, for trauma-informed organizations and leadership, and she spends much of her free time listening to Brené Brown leadership podcasts. So you'll notice on the slide that you'll all be muted, you'll all be off camera. You can use the chat function, please, to comment and to ask questions throughout the presentation. Make sure the drop down is set to panelists and attendees if you want everyone else to see your comments. If you're having technical difficulties, you can also put that in the chat. You may just want to let just the panelists know that. And at the end of this webinar, we'll put an evaluation link in the chat because we'd very much like to hear your feedback.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. So EVA BC respectfully acknowledges that our offices are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As I reflect on what this means for the work that we're doing today, what comes to mind is the notion that we can't create more trauma-informed organizations without also working to decolonize our organizational practices. So we can't make our workplaces more trauma-informed without also making them more culturally safe, given the impacts of intergenerational trauma and ongoing structural violence against Indigenous peoples. And I will invite Susan to provide a land acknowledgement now as well.
I'm honored to be speaking to you today from the ancestral, the unceded, the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw and Syilx peoples. And recently I have received a teaching by Tatiana Michelle Nahani, who is Squamish, that when we do this, when we acknowledge the traditional lands that we are on, that we're invoking the good medicine of that land. We are asking that the prayers and the ceremonies and the medicines that over the generations, that it stays with the land. And so when we acknowledge the land, we are gathering that to us, to our spirits.
Thank you so much, Susan. And we invite you all to utilize the chat function to acknowledge the land where you're joining from today. And as Laura had mentioned, if you can choose panelists and attendees, then everybody will see your land acknowledgement. And we just invite you as well as we move through today's webinar to reflect on what this means as you consider the role of organizations and of leadership in mitigating the impacts of vicarious trauma.
We have an ambitious agenda for our hour today. We're going to just do a very quick review of the terms that describe the various ways that this work molds us. We're going to look specifically at leadership burnout. We're going to look at what does a trauma-impacted organization look like? Also, what does a trauma-informed, well organization look like? We're going to suggest some organizational assessments, talk about why we want to assess how we're doing as an organization, look at strategies that support us in being as well as possible in the work, again, from an organizational perspective, and finally to discuss what are the components of being a trauma-informed organization. We often talk about trauma-informed care in terms of what we're providing to the people that we are serving. But there is also a deep body of research and knowledge about what it means to be trauma-informed in terms of how we work with each other. Our focus, obviously, today is on organizational wellness. And it's specifically speaking to those who are in leadership positions. But leadership is not just our formal leaders, our managers, our executive directors, our board of directors. It is, of course, that. But it's also all of us who are informal leaders or emerging leaders or hold responsibilities within our team environments. And so I'm going to ask you all to be thoughtful no matter how you see yourself situated in your organization, to be conscious of the role that you carry and how you may bring some of the concepts that we're discussing today into your work with management, with colleagues. So the terms, vicarious trauma, being an umbrella term that describes the cumulative impacts that come from exposure to others' suffering, but also engagement with others' suffering. And vicarious trauma was a term that came out of feminist informed research. Then secondary traumatic stress, that is a more acute presentation, it's intrusive. It often is experienced in terms of flashbacks, dreams, intrusive thoughts that is related to a client's trauma. Compassion fatigue happens over time. It is an erosion of our sense of connection and compassion to ourselves and to others. Often others in terms of the people we serve, but it can also be to our loved ones. And then finally, burnout. Burnout is often cumulative as well, but it happens in terms of the impact of systems. So it's a physical and emotional exhaustion as a result of prolonged stress. Usually the stress of having a high level of demand with not enough resources in which to meet that demand and dealing with unresponsive systems. And we will spend more time highlighting that particular impact today. Overall, I just broad strokes want to talk about some of the stresses of being in nonprofit management. That as leaders, we have the responsibility for others, our staff's well-being, our clients' safety and access. That responsibility is often held with an ongoing sense of not enough resources to do that well or as well as we would like. Some of us in management have the dual roles of leadership and a clinical workload. We may be serving survivors as well. Often managers are caught in the crosshairs of trauma response and unresponsive systems. So knowing what good trauma-informed care is, and yet not being able to move the systems that are part of that response into being trauma-informed as well. And another stress is that in the anti-violence field, we typically have lower wages and benefits, which often ends up accompanied with a high exposure to vicarious trauma, resulting in a high turnover in our staff, which overall stresses our entire organization. And although there's only one slide on the overall stresses in nonprofit management, we probably could go on and on. I think that those are capturing some of the really key points of what our leaders are holding. I am going to show you a video that talks about burnout. And the reason that I'm focusing on burnout in this webinar is that, of course, management is not exempt from the risks of vicarious trauma, but leaders are, I think, at more risk of burnout because of that crosshairs position of the responsibility towards all peoples who are accessing the organization and not enough resources. And I think that as our knowledge around vicarious trauma has emerged, that we don't recognize or validate the significance of burnout enough. One can be burned out and also experiencing some of the other impacts of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue.
Hi everyone. Before we begin, we at Psych2Go would like to give a big thank you for your support. Psych2Go's mission is to make psychology and self-care topics more accessible to everyone. In today's video, we'll be discussing the 7 signs you're emotionally burnt out. Ever since the term was first coined by American psychologist Herbert Freudenberger back in the 1970s, burnout has been a popular topic of interest for many scholars in the field of psychology. Based on a study by Later and others, emotional burnout is defined as a negative psychological state that may manifest physical, behavioral, and cognitive symptoms that impair our normal functioning and cause us severe distress. No matter what you do or how you do it, stress is an inevitable part of life. Everyone has to deal with it from time to time. However, when stress gets out of hand and becomes too much for you to cope with, it will put your mental health at risk. Here are 7 signs that can help you tell if you're emotionally burnt out. 1. You're chronically fatigued. There's a difference between being tired and fatigued. Both are responses to stressors, but tiredness goes away with the right amount of rest and recuperation, while fatigue is more enduring. When you're emotionally burnt out, it can feel like no amount of food, sleep, or relaxation can make you feel better. You're exhausted all the time. 2. You're not taking care of yourself. Are there any concerning changes in your eating and sleeping patterns? These changes are often the first and most prominent signs of emotional burnout. When you stop eating or sleeping right, it negatively impacts both your physical and mental health. According to researchers Pahlavi and Herman, people who feel emotionally exhausted often experience loss of appetite and lack of restful sleep. In severe cases, some people even feel so drained that they stop showering, exercising, brushing their teeth, and dressing presentably altogether. Before we jump to the next point, we also want to let you know that we previously released a video on types of highly sensitive people. If you haven't gotten a chance to watch it, do check it out later. Basically, HSPs are also more likely to get emotionally burnt out. So if you find yourself easily being drained emotionally, then you might be an HSP. 3. Your performance is declining. Have you noticed the quality of your work go down lately? Are you less productive at what you do? Try comparing your performance from a few months or years ago to how it is today and see if there's a significant difference. Emotional burnout is a gradual process that takes place over an extended period of time, so it can be difficult to pinpoint when exactly your performance started to worsen. Looking at it from a long-term perspective can help you figure out whether or not you've just hit a temporary rough patch or if you're already suffering emotional exhaustion. 4. You're emotionally volatile. Do you often throw temper tantrums at the slightest provocation? When you neglect your mental health and fail to satisfy your emotional needs, it's harder for your mind to function as well as it used to. This may manifest as difficulty controlling and maintaining your emotions. If you're suffering from emotional exhaustion, your feelings are likely all over the place. You become more sensitive and irritable. Frustration, pessimism, guilt, and anger are common, as well as feelings of emptiness and dread. All of these are telltale signs that your mind is already crying for help. 5. You feel down most of the time. According to a study by Bianchi and others in 2015, lack of energy and motivation are to be expected in the early stages of burnout, but symptoms of anxiety and depression may develop over time if the problem is left untreated. If you're feeling down more than not, it's time for you to start taking better care of yourself, mentally and emotionally. 6. Your social life is going downhill. Being emotionally burnt out may cause you to have no energy or desire to spend time with your loved ones. Do you tend to push away your friends and family without meaning to? Do you find yourself neglecting your social roles and duties as a sibling, partner, or friend? Do you experience more interpersonal conflicts? Emotional burnout is a very ugly and painful experience that often affects not just our mental health, but our social functioning as well. In fact, studies have shown that social withdrawal and isolation is one of the worst consequences of poor mental health, causing a lot of people to suffer alone in silence. Lastly, 7. You feel hopeless. Emotional burnout usually gives way to feelings of despair, emptiness, and detachment. You spend all of your time and energy mulling over all the things you need to do and end up leaving none of it for yourself and your well-being. You start to feel unfulfilled by the things that used to give your life meaning, and you find it hard to feel any sort of pleasure at all anymore because you fear that nothing you do will matter in the end. You don't see the point of it all anymore, so you give up. In a culture that values achievement, success, and productivity, it's easy to lose yourself in your work or your school. A lot of us have been brought up to believe that we must always push ourselves to excel and do our very best all the time. However, it's important to know when to draw the line and find the time to care for ourselves and put our emotional needs first. Emotional burnout is an easy trap to fall into, but difficult to climb out of. Fortunately, though, it doesn't just happen overnight. Self-awareness is key. Once you've recognized the signs of emotional burnout, try to find out what could be the root cause of it. Do all these signs sound familiar to you? How many signs do you relate to? What do you think might be the cause of it?
Thank
And what do
you.
you plan to do next?
So a review of the key points in that video. If one is experiencing burnout, we're chronically fatigued, we're not taking care of ourselves, our performance is declining. Emotionally volatile, although I must say that often that's not expressed, but we can feel volatile inside. And I think oftentimes that might be brought into our personal sphere and we're exploding over small matters. Down most of the time is that the activities that once gave us significant joy aren't any longer. That we may find that we are avoiding social contact, our isolation is increasing, that we have dread of particular work tasks or work conversations, that our work is no longer giving us a sense of fulfillment, and that we may find that we just feel detached from our work outcomes, from the issues, and detached from work relationships. If this is speaking to any of you, and if you haven't had the opportunity to participate in our second webinar, which was about tools to mitigate vicarious trauma, then I really recommend that once it becomes uploaded, that you do take a look at that and see, are there some extra tools that you could add to your toolkit to offset and to come out of burnout. Some practical things that if you are experiencing burnout, please set limits on your work time, particularly when we're in leadership positions, so we know it can leak over into our personal lives. Delegate, begin nurturing other forms of leadership in the organization. Unplug from your electronics, your work communication in your off time. Say no to new commitments, not just for yourself personally, but sometimes also for the organization. If we're already working at max and that commitment doesn't come with the resources to support it, growth isn't always the answer. Gather with other managers from other agencies, collaborate, share, combine resources. Pema Chodron is a mindfulness expert, a Buddhist nun actually from Nova Scotia, and she says this: rejoicing in ordinary things is not sentimental or trite. It actually takes guts. Each time we drop our complaints and allow everyday good fortune to inspire us, we enter the warrior's world. We can do this even at the most difficult moments. Everything we see, hear, taste, and smell has the power to strengthen and uplift us. So that's us pausing now at looking at impacts on individuals. And for the rest of our time together, we're going to be shifting our focus to organizations and organization wellness.
So there is a lot of research emerging that builds on the research on individual risk and protective factors for vicarious trauma. And we know a lot about those risk and protective factors, and they've been articulated in many places, including the paper that Laura mentioned earlier that we wrote for the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime. And I believe Laura will pop that link in the chat for you if you'd like to go and read that. But rather than kind of providing a long review of the literature for you, I thought better to focus on this one article, which was a case study of an anti-violence agency in the United States. And it's a very recent article, but it really helps us to understand the effects of an unhealthy organization and how we can start to shift to become a more healthy agency and organization. And so I think there's lots of lessons here. So this is from, I'll just read this quote from the author, Sarah Jarek. So organizations have an ethical responsibility to create healthy and trauma-informed organizational cultures that protect the well-being of their workers. And she goes on to say that such efforts are likely to also promote the organizational mission by enhancing the effectiveness of interventions and the quality of services provided. And I think this is really important for us to remember, that focusing on the safety and health and well-being of our staff is part of the work towards providing better services and ensuring that survivors are better supported. So she says we must prioritize, protect, and promote staff well-being. Thanks, Susan. So just to briefly tell you about this particular case study, and you'll probably be able to relate to much of this, but the services that this agency provided were a transition house, a children's program, counseling services, legal advocacy, a crisis hotline, domestic violence and sexual assault crisis response teams, and outreach. And so it was a multi-service agency. They had 40 staff, all women, working in the agency, which was located in a small city. And so the researcher engaged with 29 of the direct service staff. You can see the demographics there. So very well educated, mostly white, many under the age of 30 and newer to their work, 1 year with the organization or less. And most, as I said, were in advocate roles rather than program coordinator or supervisor positions. And so the researcher spent lots of time with folks in the agency, both interviewing staff and also attending and observing staff meetings, board meetings, having informal conversations with staff, and reviewing the staff handbook. And what she found was that in this unhealthy organization, as it's described, many of the staff were experiencing multiple symptoms of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, and what she has described as soul pain. So they were experiencing headaches, nightmares, emotional numbness, physical and emotional exhaustion, and spiritual unrest. Within the organization, her observations were that vicarious trauma was very much framed as an individual issue. So the responsibility for addressing and preventing vicarious trauma was very much placed on the individual worker. And what that meant is that there was a sort of subtle victim blaming that happened within the organization, where people, who were experiencing symptoms or signs of vicarious trauma were really understood to have not, worked hard enough to do all the self-care things that we know we should do. And so this led to high turnover, of course, as Susan had mentioned. And because turnover was very much considered to be unavoidable, it meant that, burnout was expected and staff were treated as expendable because they were expected to burn out and move on. And so this had a really significant impact on turnover, and then, of course, on the quality of services that they provided to survivors. And so, while it may seem simple, Sarah Jurek points to two important steps once we can recognize that perhaps there are some things about our organizations that are unhealthy. The first is really to assess the organizational response and prevention of vicarious trauma. And then the second is to make some positive changes to the organizational structure and culture. And so some of the solutions put forward in the article were things like workforce vicarious trauma training, which we know is very important. Staff wellness areas, so having space within the organization where staff can go to take care of themselves and to take some time out for themselves. Creating incentive systems for self-care, so it's actually supported sort of quite clearly by the leadership in the organization. Building in team building exercises, having dialogue about safety, so that could look like town hall meetings or other kinds of staff meetings where safety concerns can be brought forward. Importantly is quality supervision, and that's throughout the literature we can see that quality supervision is very important, a regular quality supervision. And mental health support. So making sure that there are affordable, accessible mental health services and additional supports available to staff. Revisiting workloads and making sure that workloads are in fact reasonable. And then, of course, ensuring that our workers are paid a living wage and that they have adequate pay. And so you can see that some of these do require perhaps additional resources, and others can be done without resources. And I think that's really important that we take the time to move forward some of the low or no cost solutions to prevent vicarious trauma.
Thank you. So some indicators that a workplace is unwell, and I created this visual, and I would want you, of course, to reflect on your own organization in no particular order, because you can see that in the blue circle, these all have an interrelationship. Staff may not be following policy, and there may be aggression or disconnection among staff. A belief that improvement is not possible and a lack of future vision. And often when that exists, an outcome of that is negativity towards management. And again, that could be program management and leadership, or it could be board of directors, or both. A high rate of leave, absenteeism, also an inability of the teams to work well together. People tend to work in silos, work in isolation. A lack of flexibility and reluctance to change. And another outcome of that is an inability to meet deadlines or to get the work done. And I would like to ask, particularly when we look at high rate of leave and absenteeism, for those who can answer this, if you think about the last year within your organization, what percentage of staff leave would you attribute primarily to vicarious trauma? That staff have had to take leave, whether that's short-term, long-term leave, due to vicarious trauma. We're going to put up a poll question. And for those of you who can answer that question, if you would click, this is all anonymous, of what percentage you think that is. Less than 10%, 10 to 30%, 30 to 50, 50 to 70%, 70% and higher. So I'll just give you an opportunity to respond to that poll. Those who are with us live, of course, if you're watching the recorded version, you don't get to vote, but we'll visit the results of this poll a little bit later. Moving forward is what do we know about factors that mean that our organization may have resilience, have a sort of protective factors against vicarious trauma, or our organization may be at higher risk. And so if you can look at this, the factors within the risk of greater vulnerability to vicarious trauma is if we don't have enough policy or procedures, or we have inconsistent application of policy and procedures that guide how we do our work and how we are with each other. That there's a different application of rules for different employees. There's a lack of resources to meet expectations. That leadership may have difficulty making decisions, or that leadership is unable or unwilling to correct their errors when they are made. That overall in the organization, there isn't a tolerance for errors. And there isn't outright recognition for good work. So that's on the higher risk side. And you can see that it's, again, with what Kate has just said, that we can, if some of that is true for our organization, we can move into resilience by correcting some of that. And by correcting these things, most of these would not take financial resources. It takes intent, it takes will, it takes commitment, it does take work, but not financial resources. More factors. We're at higher risk of vicarious trauma if our workers actually feel unsafe. And that's even more relevant to us as we all work through a global pandemic. if communication throughout the organization is limited, if there's an atmosphere of secrecy, if you never know when you might be in trouble, if environmental conditions are absent. And what we mean by environmental conditions is safety, belonging, consistency, predictability, opportunity, acceptance, hope. These are all lists of environmental conditions. If they don't exist, then we're at higher risk. If there are no or few opportunities to debrief and access support from our peers, and if we don't have reflective practice that is embedded and encouraged in the organization. Again, if any of these factors exist in your organization, you can see on the other column how we can move this into resiliency. So I just want to share our poll before we move on, that I'm going to share the results so all that can see that 41% of those who voted said that less than 10% of staff are off due to vicarious trauma. 20% thought it was, 20% who voted thought 10 to 30% of our people are off because of vicarious trauma. 24%, 30 to 50% of staff leave is due to vicarious trauma. 10% is voted, said, I think it's 50 to 70%. And 5% said it's 70% and higher. And I would encourage you, for those who are live and those who are seeing this in later, the recorded version, you might want to take a screenshot of this poll, because that speaks volumes. And if you're needing to get the attention of your board of directors, of funders, does vicarious trauma cost us in many different ways? Yes, it does. And even just this result is a strong case for ensuring that we have organizational strategies for mitigating vicarious trauma. Thank you so much for your participation in the poll. I appreciate that. Organizational assessments. Well, what does that give us? When do we do it? Well, you do it, most of us end up doing it in a more reactive way, not proactive. Oftentimes we do it when we become aware that vicarious trauma is affecting our organization to a great degree, where we are aware that there's staff conflict, and where there's staff conflict, often leadership can become a target. When there's just a disengagement, and when there's a disengagement from staff, leadership tends to pay for that in blood, sweat, and tears, meaning having to dig in deeper, to engage even more, of trying to move this along and offset that disengagement. High turnover, in which, when we have a high turnover or turnout, as it's written, what happens is that our clients become dissatisfied with the instability in the organization. They sometimes will drop out of service. We have an increase in our wait list. We have an increased load internally in terms of mentoring and onboarding new staff. Staff who are remaining are impacted by the loss of these work relationships, which often can result in disengagement or a sense of being overburdened. And then we have increased vicarious trauma. So if this is happening, this is absolutely a signal of it's time to come into doing an organizational assessment. And what does an organizational assessment give us? It exists, it helps us move from that lens of it's an individual staff problem, which is what Jarek was highlighting in the one organization that she studied, and that this is an organizational issue. And it helps name the vicarious trauma as a serious organizational hazard. It promotes accountability in our structures, in our policies, our procedures, in our leadership. It helps us develop policy that is trauma sensitive, that promotes trauma recovery in all aspects of our organization, not just our service delivery to the people we serve, but in how we're interacting with each other, how we're creating a safe space for each other. And it can provide a process to enhance trauma recovery for all of us. Now, we do need to ask ourselves, are we ready to become trauma informed in terms of how we interact with each other? Are you ready to see what your staff are actually experiencing? I often, when I'm teaching counselors, I will say to them, do not ask a question you're not ready to hear the answer. And that would be very relevant here. 2 suggested beginning places for an organizational assessment. The first one is a trauma-informed practice guide put out by the BC Centre of Excellence for Women's Health. And why I would suggest starting there is that it's very short. It provides just an initial direction. It's a checklist of seeing how you're doing in terms of being trauma-informed in 8 areas of your organization. So it asks you questions about overall policy and program mandate, leadership, hiring practices, staff training, staff support and supervision, screening and assessment, policies and procedures, monitoring and evaluation. The second resource is a small booklet, and it also has various assessments with links, but provides a framework of supervision to actually mitigate vicarious trauma. It is a short review of the research on organizational responses, a pretty good resource to present to your board of directors if you're needing to make a case for assigning resources and work hours to organizational assessment. And then once you have done those and perhaps realize, yes, we have some work to do, it's highly recommended that where a deeper dive into an organizational assessment is one that is called Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, a blueprint for vicarious trauma-informed organization. It was put out by the Office for Victims of Crime, specifically developed for an organization that is serving survivors of violence. There's research on this tool. I'll let you know it's referenced in your tip sheet that will be published soon. And the link for that assessment, which is a deeper dive, really good guidance, will be in the chat shortly. We'll come back to familiar names if you've participated in the other 2 webinars, Perlman and McKay, the people who brought us our foundational knowledge on vicarious trauma. For organizations, they said 4 main strategies. Ensure that you have adequate salary and time off. Research is slam dunk that when salary is adequate, we have much lower turnover in staff. Sufficient orientation and training, supervision, so that staff can feel competent in their evolving roles, and that they actually feel ongoing support, that you have active plans for staff safety, and access to medical and mental health supports. So some of these clearly come with the need for dollars. We need dollars in order to have the mental health supports and medical supports in place, but some of them do not. They go on further that organizational processes that will mitigate vicarious trauma is if everyone is working within a team. If we have alternate ways of connecting with each other, we come back to team building, we come back to informal ways of just being with each other. Do we have one-on-one mentors that are being fostered? Do staff have input at all levels of the hierarchy, and are processes in place for them to have that input? And is there transparency behind the resource allocation, the work assignments, the policies that are in place? And so we want to come back to some staff words, some staff's language. In one research it was a research study of a sexual assault response agency. And the researcher asked, what has it been like for you to work here? And so this one worker who the agency that she was working for was considered to be low on support, to be one of the organizations that was at high risk of vicarious trauma. She said, I think more staff support would make it easier. My assistant and I are kind of on our own. We have about 23 people that work here. So we're the only two that do it, sexual assault work. So we feel isolated sometimes. At times that has been frustrating because I would like to work somewhere where there's a real team approach. High organizational support agency. So the same study, people doing sexual assault work, but this staff person worked in an organization that had a great deal of support, that was resilient when it came to supporting their staff around vicarious trauma. And in her response to what has it been like for you to work here? For me, it's been really exciting and challenging because no day is ever the same. And because I get to grow and to stretch in different areas. When I want to learn about something, I have that chance to learn about something. It's a huge organization, but it's an intimate organization. So that's really nice. Even though it's huge, there's not a lot of bureaucracy. And that sort of thing. Sorry, there's not a lot of bureaucracy and that sort of thing. But it's huge enough to have the resources that you need and also the diversity. You learn so much from different people around you and the styles that they have and their background, sharing information. I really like it. And so it's interesting, and you can see how robust this worker's feeling. And what she is drawing on is the autonomy and the flexibility that she has in her role, and that she also feels very connected and supported in her organization versus the other one who felt so isolated and disconnected. And the connection as well that really comes through in this particular slide is not only just with her peers, but there's connection with management as well. It's peer and management connection.
Okay. Thanks, Susan. So I'm just going to run through three what are called go-to elements of safety to improve both the psychological and safety and spiritual safety for staff. And these come from a very recently published book called A Little Book About Trauma-Informed Workplaces. And so the first element is go-to leaders. So this means people in positions of authority or with influence within the organization who have trusting relationships with staff, who are open to feedback from staff and staff feel confident providing feedback, and who engage with their staff with understanding and empathy. And so, I think this is a call to all of us to become go-to leaders and whatever our role is within the organization, whether we are in an official formal leadership role or within a more informal leadership role. The next slide will talks about go-to peers. And so this is really the mutual support that staff can gain from each other, creating encouraging, safe and trusting relationships where staff can raise some of those difficult questions and concerns that they're having with their peers and ensure and feel that they will be treated with respect, and those conversations can be in a confidential environment. But there's also a call to leadership here, to support staff, to have fun, to build relationships with one another, to spend time outside of work meetings together, which has become, I think, more challenging for many people within the context of COVID, where we sort of meet, if we're working remotely, we meet for meetings and very rarely have opportunities to connect outside of work meetings. But there is really an important role that we can play in supporting staff to eat to lunch together safely or outside, even virtually via Zoom, to talk, to laugh, to have relationships with one another outside of the work itself. And of course, the research very much confirms that peer support and debriefing are one of the most important resources for staff in mitigating the impacts of vicarious trauma, particularly within anti-violence organizations. And then the third element here is go to safe spaces. So can you, within your organization, create or secure some space for employees to go when they need to take some time for themselves, to do some self-care? Is there a space that's comfortable, that is away, a little bit separated from the work stress and pressures, that staff can spend some time, whether it's outdoors or indoors, and something that's accessible and private. So just having that space, and that space being, supported, that staff can take the time for themselves if they need to step away for their own self-care. And then when we go, if you were to look at the resource that Susan mentioned with the assessment for organizational assessment tool that put out by the BC Centre of Excellence for Women's Health, we can see that in these next slides, we're thinking about applying a trauma-informed practice framework to our organizations. So we already apply that in so many ways to the work that we do to support survivors, but how can we also apply that to our organizations and to support the structures and the culture to be more trauma-informed? So safety, I think we all know safety first is the most important thing. And so how can we ensure physical and emotional and spiritual, psychological safety for our staff? Are, again, those go-to safe spaces? Do we have spaces that we can use for that purpose? Are we utilizing critical incident debriefing when traumatic events occur? Of course, WorkSafe BC and EFAP, we can access some of these resources at no cost. And have we done a safety audit on our physical environment? What have we done not only on the sort of psychological well-being, but also the physical safety? So this quote from one of the anti-violence workers who participated in Sarah Jarek's research, the case study, said, "It's not proactive by any means, it's reactive, almost to the point where someone has to be visibly broken down or someone has to seek out help." And so that's an example of what the impacts of an unhealthy organizational culture look like. So how can we be more proactive about these kinds of pieces of building safety? And then we look at empowerment, another common concept for us in our work. But how can we honor the voices of the workers in our agencies and support their growth and development and self-determination? Can we give them a say in some of the work that they're taking on or the workload? And really increase their impact and contribution, their sense of contributing to the mission of the organization. And this is very much also about valuing the whole person. And so when we can empower our staff, it shows that the research shows that they do have lower levels of secondary traumatic stress. Next is trustworthiness. So how can we both make tasks clear, consistently apply our policies, maintain appropriate boundaries, and as leaders model all of these good practices? Are leaders monitoring their own dual and overlapping relationships? So do leadership or leaders within the organization have personal friendships with staff or with board members, and how do we maintain those boundaries? How do we also, if we're providing clinical supervision internally, how do we clarify and make clear for staff when we're showing up in a clinical supervisor role and when we're showing up in a more human resources oriented role or conversation? How can we just consistently show up with honesty, integrity, and transparency to increase our workers' trustworthiness in the organization? The next principle is choice. So again, how can we support staff to have greater levels of choice and control over their own work circumstances? And, you know, depending on their where they're at with their time with the organization and their role, how can we support greater choice and control? How can we balance and prioritize the needs of our staff and the needs of our funders and the needs of external stakeholders? And I think COVID has been, you know, a great example of many funders working very creatively to support organizations in getting their work done while also recognizing the impacts of COVID. And so if we could bring that, you know, same kind of approach to our work day to day in this sector, how could that be helpful in supporting our staff? Also recognizing that, you know, we have a opportunity, really. You can go to the next slide, Susan, thanks. An opportunity to engage our staff in the planning and the development of our programs and monitoring of those programs, collaborating with them at all levels and sharing power. So whether that's involving staff in organizational strategic planning, you know, finding ways for them to meaningfully contribute and engage in the broader decision-making of the organization, as we know that that can have a significant impact on job satisfaction and on retention. So applying all of those trauma-informed practice principles to our organizations, we can really support our workers to be to have more supportive environments, to change the organizational work culture, and to improve the health and safety of our staff so that they can provide the best services to survivors of gender-based violence. And I think that will bring us to a close at 2:28. And I'll turn it over to Laura to invite us to participants to complete the evaluation and send us on our way.
Oh, look at that, 2:28. We're wrapping up on time. It was very, very worthwhile. I have put a link for the evaluation form in the chat. So if you could please take a minute and click on that and give us some feedback, we would much appreciate it. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you so much, Kate. Any last words for either of you? We have one or 2 minutes left.
There's just a few links that I would love to get into chat. Some people may think, what is Susan talking about? Because I put out there that there's a free book that has just been published called Trauma Informed Workplaces. And I'd like to get the link in the chat for you because it looks like a great resource. Some of our slides were based on it, and it is possible to get it for free. So that's going to come super quick in your chat, and you could copy that. And I also will get into the chat the deeper dive organizational assessment that was put out by the Office of Victims of Crime, because we haven't gotten that into the chat yet. So hang out if you can for just a few more minutes for those who are live with us, and for those who aren't, who are just viewing the recording and thinking, oh, I'm missing out on something. These resources are published in the tip sheets as well. It will be there in the future for you. Thank you so much. We were packed today. So many people gathered for this topic, and I really appreciate your presence and hope that there are new thoughts of what you could do to foster greater wellness overall in your organization.